Republican Congressman Mike Gallagher of Wisconsin. He's on the Armed Services Committee, but we should also note he served in the United States Marines in Iraq in 2007-2008. Congressman, we appreciate you taking the time this morning.
Thanks for having me.
You served in Iraq in 2007-2008 at really some of the worst moments of the Iraq War, at a time, in fact, when Soleimani's Quds forces that he controls were supplying powerful IEDs, which killed, by the Pentagon's estimate, more than 600 U.S. soldiers, of course, wounded thousands more. What does this assassination mean to you and other veterans who served on the ground there?
Well, I think it means that we've taken Iran's most dangerous warrior off the battlefield. And as you referenced, that's 1 out of every 6 combat fatalities in Iraq. So Soleimani was a mass murderer, not only in Iraq. He not only had American blood on his hands, but he's responsible for the death of thousands around the region. He is the architect of the Hezbollah model throughout the region, whereby Iran builds proxies in places like Syria, Lebanon, and Yemen to threaten our interests. And indeed, Soleimani is the man responsible for taking Iran away from the Iraqis and making it an Iranian satrap and potentially a forward operating base to attack Saudi Arabia and Israel.
As you know, and you mentioned them, Iran has enormous capabilities in the region and around the world, including through its proxy forces that you mentioned there. There are thousands of U.S. forces deployed now around the region. In addition to that, U.S. diplomats and civilians, which Iran has not been shy about attacking before. Are those interests, are those Americans at risk today, at greater risk today than they were before this assassination, as Iran contemplates and threatens, in fact, retaliation?
Well, I think it's important to remember that Iran has indeed been engaged in systematic escalation for the better part of the last year. They attacked our shipping vessels in the region and those of our allies. They downed an American drone. They attacked the Abqaiq facility in Saudi Arabia. And we actually were very measured in terms of not responding to those incidents. And now we established a clear red line of don't kill Americans. And if you do, we will respond. And we have enforced that red line. And so I just would argue that it's the Iranians that have been escalating. I would argue further that it is inaction that is the most provocative, and that President Trump has absolutely made the right call here. He has sent a very simple and strong signal that if you kill Americans, we will kill you.
Should Americans be prepared for war with Iran today?
Well, the whole paradox of deterrence is that in order to avoid war, you have to be prepared to go to war. And it is my hope that this bold action, this strong action, restores our deterrent posture. It is fundamentally a defensive action. It is prudent deterrence, and thereby will allow us to stand strong with our allies in the region in order to avoid war. And I would further note that Iran is in an increasingly weak position regionally. It's in an increasingly weak position politically, domestically. There are anti-Iran protests in Iraq, in Iran itself, and in Lebanon. And so I think we have an opportunity to de-escalate, and Iran should know that we will be prepared to respond if our people are threatened.
When you served in Iraq, you served alongside General Petraeus, this under George W. Bush, of course. General George W. Bush listened to Petraeus. He listened and consulted with his advisors before he made decisions. This is a president who often has ignored or surprised even his advisors with decisions. For instance, the withdrawal of U.S. forces from Syria, which I should note you opposed here. In this, again, Senator Lindsey Graham, he's chairman of the Judiciary Committee, not one of the Gang of Eight, who, of the relevant committees. He was informed in advance. Are you confident in a president that consistently bypasses the national security structure that is designed to help him make difficult decisions like this?
Well, I don't think that's the case here, because I know for a fact that this target package was under discussion for days, if not weeks, if not months. This has been something that the administration has been debating for a while, whether or not to take Mohandas and Soleimani off the battlefield. So I would say this is actually an instance where, over the course of at least 11 attacks against our interests by Iran, the president has chosen to either not respond or respond with things below the threshold of the use of force, like cyber weapons. And now he consulted with his generals, he consulted with the Secretary of Defense, and decided to take bold action against Soleimani so that the Iranians don't continue to escalate. So I just don't agree that that criticism is apposite in this case.
Let's ask then what the goal is with this policy here. We had John Bolton, until recently, was the national security advisor to the president, praising this. He, like you, says that this decision in his tweet was long in the making. But he goes on to say, hope this is a first step to regime change in Iran, something Bolton has championed before. Is that what Americans should prepare for here, that the intention is to change the regime in Iran?
I don't think that's the goal that Secretary Pompeo has laid out. Indeed, Secretary Pompeo has talked exclusively about behavior change in Iran. We have no problem with the Iranians deciding the future of Iran themselves. Indeed, we look forward to a day when the Iranian people are able to have more of a say in their own future and aren't dominated by the clerical, evil, theocratic regime that keeps them oppressed. However, we will not stand idly by while that regime exports terrorism, while it continues to threaten our interests, kill Americans, and threaten our allies in the region. So it is all about behavior change, and then hopefully the Iranians will be able to change their regime democratically at one day in the future.
I want to ask you quickly before we go about impeachment, a Senate trial looming here. During the House process here, House Republicans argued there was no direct link between the president's decision between the decision to withhold aid from Ukraine and the president himself. We now have emails, which were blocked by the White House, but now been released through good reporting by Just Security, showing the opposite. One email from the OMB to the Department of Defense, obtained by Just Security, said the following: clear direction from POTUS to continue to hold. Can you and other Republicans still argue that this was not the president's decision to withhold the aid?
Well, the president has the authority to withhold aid for a variety of reasons. The president has had a long skepticism.
The Pentagon said it was an illegal decision.
In general,
Pentagon officials protested and said that this broke the law because Congress had appropriated the funds.
Well, you talked earlier about the president ignoring the interagency process. This is how the interagency process works. You have various stakeholders that have different opinions. Oftentimes, it's the State Department arguing against the Pentagon. In this case, the president withheld aid for potentially a variety of reasons. As it pertains to the impeachment trial, as I understand it, Mitch McConnell isn't foreclosing the possibility of witnesses. He's merely insisting on the same Clinton standard that was unanimously agreed to by people, including Chuck Schumer at the end in 1999. And usually you have opening arguments, then you have written questions, and then you decide on witnesses from there. So if there's more to be investigated, I'm sure they'll get to it. I haven't followed the machinations of the Senate that closely. Okay. I will, however, note that the whole argument for rushing this in the House and that ignoring the courts is now bunk because Nancy Pelosi has not sent the articles to the Senate.
Sure. Well, true. Although it could have been made easier by the White House if they allowed those officials to testify or supplied the documents. But we'll save that further discussion for another day. Congressman, we do appreciate you taking the time this morning.
Thank you, Jim.